little bit about me, and then I'll kind of get to it. So I grew up. I graduated from college years ago. I was a technical guy. I was an engineer. I was lucky enough to join a small startup in the Bay Area called Oracle. Maybe you've heard of it. Was
it really a startup back then?
It was about, yeah, I mean, it wasn't probably as small as some of your companies, but it was still pretty small where you knew everybody and, my group grew from, there were 5 of us when I started. 3 years later, there were 400. So that's pretty meteoric growth, which I hope all of you get a chance to experience. I then left Oracle with another guy from Oracle who I knew. We started a company called TenFold, and we also had great growth there for a while. And we took it public, and since then I've been doing some nonprofit work and some angel investing and stuff like that. At TenFold, as we were at Oracle, we got to the point where we were hiring probably about 40 people a month. This is 1997, 1998. Those of you who weren't in the technology world back then, in San Francisco, it was, there was gold everywhere, and hiring that many people was practically impossible to do. And so we had to think about a lot of things. And so I wanted to talk about the one thing we did. We made a lot of mistakes. And we did a lot of things right. But when I look back, we did one thing, I think, really well. And that helped overcome all the mistakes. Now, before I kind of get into what that is, I want to just set the stage a little bit. So I believe that I am not smarter than most of the competition was. I'm not smarter than you. I'm not harder working than you. I wasn't harder working than the competition. And so I had to sit there and go, well, how am I going to succeed? If I'm not smarter and I'm not harder working, I don't really think I'm any luckier than anyone else. So how am I going to succeed? Sid and others will tell you that most startups fail. Even startups that raise money successfully, even a Series A, which is right after seed and after founders, and they go and they get institutions, they still fail. Is it because they're all have bad ideas? I don't buy it, right? I don't buy that if you look at all the entrepreneurs that start companies and you take from those all the ones that get funded, and they're not just all bad ideas, and they're not just really bad people running them. So why is it? So if you get to know me, you'll know that I like to be a contrarian. So I believe if you do what most people do, you will get the same results that most people get. So another way to say it is if you want different results, which is what I wanted, right? I didn't want the failure, which is the most common result, then you have to do things pretty differently. Now, if you're going to do things differently, first of all, it takes a little bit of arrogance, right? To say, hey, I know better. Right? Everybody does it this way, but I know better. But you also have to realize that doing things differently is uncomfortable. Right? There's a reason everyone does it a certain way. That's comfortable, it makes sense, it's common sense. So we did things differently. And so what is it I'm talking about? And this will sound trite at first, but just bear with me. So the one thing we did right is we hired the absolute best people. Now, everyone says they hire the best people, and everyone says they like hiring the best. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail and tell you when I said we hire the best, it's different than what you mean, and it's probably different than what you're doing. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of feedback on how you should if you're on the hiring side, hire the best. And if you're on the employee people side, looking to be hired, what you should do to be the best. And it's not probably what you're thinking. So when I started my company, I had very grandiose dreams. Right? I thought, this company, it's going to be $1 billion company, and my percentage of it is going to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So every time I went to interview someone, I used to say to myself, hey, I'm interviewing Jed here, and I say to myself, someday, in a not so far future, Jed's going to be in the office all by himself on a Sunday night, working on something because he's committed and he's got a deadline, and he's going to have to make a decision. I don't know what area he's in, but he's going to make a decision. Am I willing to bet $400 million that he makes the right decision? That's the question. And that's the question I asked myself every time I interviewed someone. Am I willing to bet, and insert whatever number you think your net worth might be if everything goes dramatically well, am I willing to bet all of that on him making the right decision? And if you're not, don't hire him. So, does that mean that every person I hired always made the right decision? Of course not. Do I make all the right decisions? Of course not. But it became clear to me that that question is the most important. So how do I find people that will make the right decision? Notice that him making the right decision has nothing to do about whether he knows Java or not, or whether he knows how to use QuickBooks or not, or whether he knows how to use Adobe Illustrator or not. None of those matter. Those are skills. Nobody, all of us who are programmers or whatever it is your job is, right? We didn't come out of the womb knowing how to program. We all learned it. Skills you can learn. There is no one out there that has 10 years experience programming for the Apple Watch. So what happens when the Apple Watch comes out? People need to learn. And then I'm using programming as an example, but this goes the same in everything, right? So, if you're an accountant, there was a world before there was SaaS, and accounting was very different. And then SaaS started coming in, and accounting is different. And there's new accounting rules. So what I realized that we needed were not certain skills, but certain traits. And so then we started thinking because I'm an engineer and I like, being very concrete, like, what traits do you look for? And how do you know if they're there? And where do you find the people that have those traits? Those were the 3 questions I had to go through. Because remember, I was trying to hire a lot of people. And when I talked to my HR person, they're like, well, the industry has certain numbers. And they'd say, for every, I forget what the numbers were, but bear with me. It was like for every 10 resumes you get, you'll like one of them. And, so then for every 10 first interviews you do, you'll bring one back for an on-site second interview. And for every 10 of those, you'll make 2 offers. And for every 10 offers you make, you'll get 4 people to accept, or whatever the number is. And I realized that if I want to hire the kinds of numbers of people I wanted to hire, I would have to do absolutely nothing all day except read resumes. So I had to find a way to change this. And so I said, no, what I want is if I interview 10 people, I want to make offers to 9 and hire 8. So I needed to have a very different process than everyone else has. So I needed to have traits that I looked for, that I could identify really quickly early on, filter people out very quickly, and get to the point where not only can I identify them, but I can make a compelling pitch to them that they will want to join my company. So what traits did I look for? And it's funny, I'll just as a segue, anyone here know a guy named Rob Webker? You know? So Rob used to work for us, and I ran into him 10 years later. And he's an adjunct professor at the U, and he asked me to come talk to his class. And on a whim, I took a piece of paper and I wrote down 3 words, and I gave it to someone. I said, Rob, you're in the back, we haven't rehearsed this. What are the 3 traits we look for when we hire people? And it was 10 years later, and he said the exact 3 words that were on the piece of paper I wrote. And they were as follows. We want people who are brilliant, who are driven, and who are nice. Because I've known a lot of brilliant, driven people who are assholes. Shouldn't say that probably, right? So, if you've seen, whatever Dr. House, I don't want to hire him. Because companies are teams, and teams need to get along, and there's a whole bunch. So, are you really telling me that you're a small company and you want to hire a programmer who's going to build your web interface, and you don't care if they know how to program or not? That's exactly what I'm telling you. Because I'm a long-term thinker. So I care about the next 5 years. So how long is it going to take a brilliant person to learn how to do whatever it is we want them to do? Experience is not a prerequisite for a job. If it were, then none of you could ever get promoted because you have no experience doing your boss's job. And experience is necessary, so you can't get promoted. And I could never have been a CEO, and your first-time CEO, and none of us could have done it. So experience is not a prerequisite. What is a prerequisite is you have to be driven and you have to be brilliant. If you're brilliant, then you can learn whatever it is I want to teach you. And if you're driven, then you'll do a good job at it. Now, driven is the nice word. Amongst ourselves, we didn't say driven. That's kind of the marketing spin. I used to say compulsive. Now, compulsive has a little bit negative connotations to it. But I'll give you an idea of what I mean, right? I remember interviewing a guy, and he walks into the interview, and he has a guitar. I'm not making this up. This is San Francisco, so you kind of go with the flow, But, I'm rolling my eyes, and I'm like, why do you have a guitar? And he says to me, well, after this interview, I have a guitar lesson. I didn't want to leave the guitar in the car because it gets hot and it'll warp. And so I'm like, okay, how do I get out of this interview? And I asked him, how long have you been taking guitar lessons? And he said, well, I take guitar lesson 3 times a week for the last 14 years. And I said to him, either you are the most incompetent, music teacher ever, learner ever, or you're exactly the kind of compulsive person I want. Because I believe that if this person is so driven to constantly improve their guitar playing, if I can get a fraction of that focused on whatever it is his job is, he will have the same drive, or she will have the same drive to constantly improve whatever it is they're in charge of. It's rare that you have people who are really perfectionists and neat, organized people in one area, and in the other area, they don't care about it and they're sloppy, and it's not likely. It's a trait. People who are that way, they're like that. And if you find them, and you can focus them on whatever it is their job is, they will be driven and they will constantly try to improve, and they're the people who are going to conferences and reading books and on forums and chat rooms, always trying to learn and how to do better and better and better. In fact, the problem you sometimes have is how to stop me, like, okay, we're not going to make this any better. It's good enough, let's ship it. But like everything, I always feel that there's a spectrum right? And on this side you have the perfectionists who never want to ship anything. On this side you have people who just put crap and hey, compile, ship it. And somewhere in the middle is right, and I never get it right. And so I always ask myself, which side would you rather err on? And I always felt I'd rather err on this side where they're too much of a perfectionist than not enough of a perfectionist. So I had determined that I want people who are brilliant, driven, and nice. So how do you determine if someone's nice? Pretty simply, right? I mean, you sit for 20 minutes, you know if they're nice or not. I've never met somebody and I thought they were really nice and then they turned out they weren't. It doesn't really happen. So how do you find out if someone is brilliant and driven? So there are a ton of brilliant people who, for a variety of reasons, didn't do well in high school, didn't go to college, didn't do it. But the flip side is also true. Right? If you go find someone who got a 1600 on the SATs and went to MIT and graduated with a 4.0, chances are they're brilliant. That doesn't mean that if you didn't do that, you're not brilliant. But I always felt that if I went to MIT and I interviewed people, there's a higher concentration of brilliant people than if I went to Chico State. Hope I don't. Anyone here go to Chico State? Okay. I'm not offending anybody. Now, there's a lot of people who, when I say kind of these kinds of things, they ask themselves, or they kind of push back and reject, and they go, well, but wait a second. I'm a great employee, I'm a great contributor, and by your standards, I would never hire myself. And I would say, absolutely. And in my standards, I wouldn't hire myself. But that's not the point. I don't want to go into the room at work and be the smartest guy in the room. I want to be the dumbest guy. I want to know that everyone in this room is better at their job than I could ever be. So I'm not the metric. It's not like, hey, I'm really good, so if you're as good as me, you can join. It's, yeah, I'm pretty good, but I want you to be a hell of a lot better than me. Because a lot of people actually have the opposite. Say, well, you're really good. Now, you're not as good as me, but you're pretty good, so I'm going to hire you. And I call that the Xerox problem. It's not exactly relevant anymore because technology has evolved, but it used to be a day where if you took a piece of paper and you took a Xerox of it, and then took the Xerox and took a Xerox of that, and took a Xerox and took a Xerox, within 4 or 5 copies, it was completely illegible. Today, that's not quite true anymore, but bear with me. So you hire someone who is 90% as good as you, and they hire someone who's 90% as good as they are, and they hire someone who's 90% as good as they are, within very little time, you have complete mediocrity. And this happens in most companies. Only way to battle it is I hire people who are better than me, and they hire people who are better than they are. And then you don't have mediocrity. And this became the pillar of everything we did. Every person we hired. In fact, so when we interview, how many of you have interviewed for a job on the hiring side? Just a couple. So usually it kind of goes like this when you've interviewed, and tell me if your experience is kind of like this. You're interviewing someone, your boss comes to you and says, hey, we're thinking of hiring a new person, we'd like you to interview them. So you go, you interview them, you talk to them, ask a bunch of questions, right? You come back, your boss says, so what'd you think of them? Oh, I really like them. Yeah, they're really energetic and they're, thumbs up. Our form was pretty simple. Any of you care to take a guess what the form, oh crap. Sorry. Any of you care to take a guess what our form looked like? So when you interviewed someone, at the end of the interview, you had to fill out a form on whether you like this person or not, whether we should hire this person or not, what your impressions, what your thoughts were. What did our form look like? I'll give you a hint. There were 3 check boxes. That was it. Did you think they were brilliant, compulsive, and nice? Driven. Brilliant. Sorry. Did you think they were brilliant? So the only debates we ever had were, well, why did you think this guy was brilliant? I didn't think he was brilliant. I thought he was a dumbass. Now, like I said, brilliance has nothing to do whether you can, on the fly, write a bunch of Java code to do a bubble sort. That has nothing to do with being brilliant. There are ways to tell whether people are brilliant. And there's some tricks, right? How do you know if someone's driven? Well, when I look at a resume, right? We hired a lot of kids right out of college or right out of high school, so it's a little bit different depending on where you're hiring, right? But if you're hiring somewhere out of college, there's the person who joined the Glee Club, and then there's the person who was the president of the Glee Club. And there was a person who joined the math team, and then there was a person who was the treasurer of the math. Now, why does anyone in college become treasurer of the Glee Club? There's no benefit. In high school, you do that so you can get into college. But in college, why would anyone do that? Nobody in their right mind thinks, I'm going to become treasurer of the Glee Club because that's going to help me get a job in the technology world. No one thinks that. They became treasurer, or they became president, or whatever the organization is, because they cared, and they're driven, and they wanted to do better. And they were part of the group, and it wasn't running well, and they wanted to run it better. And that's one of the attributes I looked for. So now I figured out what attributes I was looking for, kind of figured out where to find them. They congregate. Right? One thing that you'll find that really benefit is brilliant, driven people have other brilliant, driven people as friends. So when you hire one, if they really like it, you have a whole pipeline of more. So now you have the other side, which is, let's say you've identified this person. How do you convince them to come join your company? So, what do brilliant, driven, nice people want? So I had figured out the beginning part where I can find these people, and then I had to figure out how to get these people on board. So I would right off the bat ask people, so, you're a brilliant, driven person, and you're looking for a job, and chances are you're going to get a ton of offers. How are you going to decide? Is it just whoever pays you the most, that's where you go? Is that it? Guess how many people said yes? Very few. Probably count them on one hand. Doesn't mean it wasn't true, just means no one admitted it. But most of the time they were like, no, I care about other things as well. And so I had boiled down to, well, what do they want? What do brilliant, driven people want? Well, they want to learn. They want to be challenged. They want to make a difference. Nobody wants to go to work on a whole bunch of stuff, right? And then the stuff gets, well, thank you very much, and they throw it away. Has anyone ever worked on a project that ended up getting canceled or shelved or whatever? How'd that make you feel? You don't care because you were getting a paycheck? If that's how you felt, then you weren't the brilliant, driven person that I want to hire. Most people were pissed off if that happened. I put my blood and sweat into this, and it just got canceled. They want to see what they did succeed. They want to make a difference. And they want to learn. So some people say that if you want to teach somebody how to swim, you take them and you throw them into the pool and they figure out how to swim. And that's kind of true. Right? My family, took me on a boat and threw me out of the boat and had me swim. And my wife was reminding me that maybe they didn't want to teach you how to swim. Oh, that's a different story. But I believe that, yeah, you can probably learn how to dog paddle and get to the other side. But if you want to be an Olympic swimmer, you get a coach. Right? Michael Phelps has a coach. LeBron James has a coach. Michael Jordan had a coach. You get a coach. So when I ask people, hey, how's it going on your job? They're like, oh, it's great. I'm learning a ton. I'm like, really? Who are you learning from? Well, I'm not really learning from anyone, but I have to do a whole bunch of things I've never done before, and I'm kind of figuring it out. I'm like, yeah, that's one way to learn. Probably not the most efficient way. Because what you're doing is basically, well, I'm making the same mistakes everyone else has made, and I'm going to basically eventually learn it. So to us, if you're going to hire people who don't have the specific skills you need, but they have great traits, you have to have an environment where everyone is willing to teach. And this person is wanting to learn. And that never ends. You might learn how to be a programmer today, and tomorrow you'll learn how to be a manager, and the day after, because I'll tell you straight out that if your company grows, chances are a year from now you don't have the same responsibilities that you have today. So you need people who can adapt and learn that. So figuring out, okay, well, what is it they want to learn? So if those of you who are programmers, you got to ask yourself, there are very, very few 45-year-old programmers out there, or 55-year-old programmers. So if you're a programmer, you got to ask yourself, you have probably one of three options. One, you make a lot of money while you're still young, so then you don't have to work anymore. Number two, you work your way up the management side, right? So you become, a development manager, an engineering manager, and ultimately a CTO. So you have to learn management skills. Or three, you become an entrepreneur. And you go start a company. So then you have to learn a different set of skills. I guess there's a fourth option, which is you could become an architect, which is very different than program. So now you got to ask yourself, okay, well, I have to learn those skills. So where am I going to learn those skills? We'll find an organization that is willing to invest in teaching it. And those are hard to find. But I believe that if you find that kind of an organization, you'll be incredibly satisfied because you'll be learning whatever it is skill you want to go to. And the company that does that is very likely or more likely to succeed because they are investing in their people and they're hiring the right people. Questions? Josh?
So I love the framework. I'd love to hear a little more about how you test for compulsive. Are there other things that you do outside of a resume, which you said, and one question in the interview? What other things do you do?
So there's a bunch of questions in an interview that you can ask people. But one is I ask them, so what do you do when you're not working? What hobbies do you have? Right? And they're like, well, some of them, I watch TV or whatever. I'm like, but a lot of them are, right? Yeah, I do this thing. I do gardening, right? And suddenly I'll talk to them about gardening. Hey, this person is compulsive about.
So is that passionate or is that compulsive?
I don't know. And that's a fine line, probably. So that's an interesting conversation that maybe we can have offline. But they're very similar, I think, this compulsion, right? And compulsion, people have this impression sometimes compulsion is like, those, really sick people that have to like tap the table 5 times before they get up. And, obviously I don't mean that. Those people need help. I mean people who are driven to be the best they can be, right? So and passion is a very close, right? But it's not just, I love watching, but I want to participate and I want to make it better and I want to constantly make it better. And so they're that driven. So driven, passionate, maybe they're very similar. Other questions?
How do you balance that with the pressure of needing to get things done? Because if sometimes our time frames are so compressed, I'm speaking specifically about your demo chamber, right? Things need to get done so quickly. But if I hire somebody who doesn't know, HTML, JavaScript, whatever, and I'm playing the long game, like you said, next year, we may have changed our needs. And so we need somebody right now who can hit the ground running in a lot of cases.
So I am by no means brilliant, right? So all the criteria that I would use to judge people who are brilliant, I'm not one of them. A year ago, I decided to launch a company. And I was like, it'll be fun. I'm going to build this in PHP. How long do you think it took me to learn HTML and PHP? A couple of weeks. So obviously, if you needed a brain surgeon, I wouldn't hire somebody who's never done brain surgery. But a lot of what we do is not as complicated as you might think. And there's a lot of tasks in your organization, right? There's fixing bugs, right? You don't need to understand the whole system and all the intricacies to be able to fix a few bugs, right? Then you have, adding a little feature to an existing product, right? I mean, there are a lot of smaller bites before I need you to understand how the whole thing comes together and design a feature that has tentacles into everything. If you find a smart person, I would bet that this smart, if they're really driven, within a few weeks they'll be effective. And they will quickly pay for themselves. Now you hire someone who's a little bit mediocre, and there's the fallacy of you think something is done to find out later that it's not quite done, or it wasn't done right. And I would rather know that it's not done than think it is. So, obviously, you can't say this about absolutely everything. But if you have to err, for me, I would much rather err on I'll take my time and find the right person than hire someone who I know is not the right person, but have them give me the illusion that they're producing stuff that is going to come back to bite me later. Because if you think that there's a time later on that you're going to have more of it, we have 20 customers today, but when we have 40 customers, I'll have a lot more time. Then I'll be able to go hire all the right people and go back and fix things. Oh, when I reach $10 million, then I'll have all the time in the world to go, and do this again. You're never going to have time. If your company starts taking off, and those of you who've been there will tell you, your life just gets harder and harder. You get under more and more pressure. It never gets easier. So if you don't do it now, you'll never do it. And if you do it now, then it's like compound interest. It starts building on itself, and before you know it, you're getting massive dividends on very little investment.
So on the companies that you were building, so you're talking about coaching being really critical. So how did you structure the coaching? Who did it? Was it always the manager, or was there peer coaching?
Everybody did it all the time. And so that was part of, and so we talk about culture, right? And that's a whole nother conversation on what culture means and how to build culture. But to me, culture is not, we have ping pong tables. Pickleball. Having pickleball is a great thing, but that's not a culture. Having flex time, great idea, that's not a culture. Culture is we hold each other accountable, right? And how do you build that? Culture is we invest in teaching one another, right? Culture is, right, we expect perfection. We expect, there are certain things, right? We had a culture at TenFold of speed. It was very important to us, and I won't go into all the reasons, that we do things quickly. And so we knew that when you do things quickly, you make mistakes. And our culture was, that's okay. We know you're going to make mistakes. We still want you to move quickly. And that's a cultural thing, right? And so you have to constantly be, hey, faster, faster. Why are you still thinking about this? You know what you need to do, just do it, right? Well, I want to don't talk to anyone. You know what you want to do. Trust your gut, go with it. Make a decision. It might be wrong, but we'll find out sooner, the sooner you make a decision, right? And that was a cultural thing, and that happened in every conversation, in every meeting, until it became just natural. And the same thing with teaching and coaching. It just became natural, and there was a whole bunch of mechanics on every time I was teaching Jeb something, right? Because he, called me and, hey, can you look at my screen? I don't know how to do this. I'm like, chances are there's other people who don't know how to do this. Before I show you, I'm going to go build a quick lesson plan on this, and I'm just going to post it. So we never practically answered questions. It was always, let me write a lesson, and I'll share it with you. So then the next time someone asks, I could just send it to them. Or better yet, when I got really clever, I'd be like, hey, Jeb, I'm going to answer your question, but guess what? The price for my time is you're going to create a lesson, right? And then you're going to go find all the people who don't know this, and you're going to share it with them. So there's a lot of things you can do. But yeah, but it wasn't a structure like you have to have an hour a week with your manager so they can teach you. It was every interaction, every day, every meeting, you have to take the time to do it, and then it happens. If you don't, it's always easy to say, I just don't have time. Do me a favor, please, just do what I'm asking. I don't have time to explain why. Just do it. If you fall into that, you'll be in that always, because you'll never have the time. So having the discipline to say, I'm going to take the time, and I'm going to, and sometimes it's like, listen, I got to meet you this evening after work, and then I'll explain it, or tomorrow. So sometimes it's finding it doesn't have to be this exact moment. Or sometimes it'd be like, listen, I'm taking a list, and there's 3 topics I need to go over with you. How about we meet a week from now, and then I'll explain to you in detail why we're doing all these things. But having that list and following up on it increases this culture of teaching and learning. And it's teaching and learning things that you might not even think you know or care about, right? I learned stuff, like I know more about accrual accounting than I will ever need to know or care to know. I was deposed as an expert from the IRS on VSOE, right? It's like, I don't care. It just happens, right? Because you're learning things, and you're always learning, and every person and every job. Sorry.
No problem. So you talked a lot about identifying the candidates and about closing them and having them join you. I'd like to hear a little bit more on the beginning part, which is just finding the right people. You talked about employees, running your packs and intellectual density and like the MIT, but when you start off, you said you want to do things differently. And I feel like a lot of people target MIT people and a lot of people incentivize their employees to find. So what have you done differently to be able to tap into those veins of people?
That's a great question, and
This probably needs to be the last question answered.
Yeah, and I can be glad to follow up with some. One of the things I did, so when I went to MIT, and everyone went to MIT, or you go to the U, everyone went to the computer science department. There's lines out the door of recruiters. I never went there. I went to the astronomy department. Like, Who the hell goes trying to hire an astronomer? Those guys were desperate for anyone to talk to them. Right? Right? They're sitting there going, I can't believe what convinced me to choose astronomy or geology or whatever. But they're equally smart people. Right? So part of it is going into the departments where others aren't looking. Right? So, yeah, if you go to MIT into the computer science department, or you go to the computer science departments, everyone is going there. I bet you, if you went to the chemical engineering department, yeah, a lot of those people want to be chemical engineers. Some of them might not. The best guy I've ever hired was a physics major from Caltech. He finished, realized he does not want to do physics anymore. When I hired him, he had never written a line of code. I sent him a book on programming. I said, read this before you show up. Within a few months, he was the best programmer we ever had. If you can do physics at Caltech, you can learn PHP.